family. It's your sister, Rev Jocelyn here, and welcome to our show, Faith on the Journey. Today's episode is sacred. It's one I've held close to my heart for a long time, and I knew that when the time was right, I shared this part of my journey with you. For the first time ever on this podcast, I'm stepping out of the host seat and into the guest seat. And to moderate this conversation, I've invited someone very special, my dear sister and friend, Coach Déa. Déa is a powerful voice in the space of healing and empowerment. She's a skilled marriage and divorce coach, a certified trauma healing facilitator, and an award-winning podcast host who uses her platform to help women navigate life's most difficult transitions. She's also played a very special part in my healing journey last year, and I couldn't think of anyone better to hold this space with me today. So I invite you to listen to my story with an open heart and join us for this powerful conversation. Let us begin.
Thank you so much for this beautiful introduction. I want you to know how honored I am to be here, as I have been a part of your trajectory. And I have to say how proud I am of you that you're doing this. I think it takes a lot of courage, and I really admire you for that.
Thank you.
So with that, I want you to share with us, take us into and through your story.
Well, Coach Déa, thank you for holding space with me today. I remember it was a Sunday afternoon after church. I walked into the hotel room and greeted the clerk with a smile. And then as I entered into my hotel room, I would say, okay, I have to get myself set up for work this week and hosting meetings and trainings. And so I got myself organized because I didn't know how long I was going to stay there. And then finally, once I got settled, I sat down on my bed and then I fell back on the sheets. And as I was looking up at the ceiling, tears started rolling down my face as the reality set in that I had just walked away from my marriage. And all I could think was, how did I get here? See, when I first met my husband, he was wonderful. I mean, Déa, it was like something out of a Disney. He was my biggest fan, so supportive. I could talk to him about anything. And yes, we had our ups and downs, and we broke up, got back together more times than I can count. But, no relationship is perfect, and I loved him, and I thought love was enough. And eventually, we got engaged. And after we got engaged, I started noticing certain things that concerned me. I started feeling like he was a little controlling, and noticed he had a temper, and it seemed like he really wasn't respecting certain boundaries I had. And so I reached out to a mentor of mine from the church, and I told her about some of my concerns, but she was like, no, you all love each other. Those don't sound like a big deal. This is the devil trying to keep you two apart. And so I was like, okay, maybe I'm making a big deal out of this. And so we continued to plan the wedding, but as we got closer to the date, this feeling would not go away. It was like this small voice that eventually became a shout was telling me that something's wrong. But at this point, the invitations were out, venue was booked, people were flying into town, and I just was like, oh, maybe I'm overthinking this. I'm gonna go forward with this wedding. And so we said I do, and we had a beautiful honeymoon, but the honeymoon did not last. And it started to become a pattern of all these arguments and this feeling like I was walking on eggshells. And sometimes I'm like, what, the silent treatments? And I just felt like I was waking up in crazy land, and this anxiety that I was feeling and starting to feel depressed. And I remember calling my mentor and just saying, hey, something seems wrong here. But I didn't quite have language to describe what I was going through, because I guess it could be left to misinterpretation as newlywed problems. And that's what she thought it was. She was like, marriage is hard. When you first get married, you all can work through this. And so I was like, okay, let me work harder. And so it started to get worse, and I decided we're going to call in some professional counselors here. maybe they can help us. And it didn't take long for the professional counselors to see that something was wrong and it was signs of abuse. And as they started kind of mentioning certain things, I was like, abuse? No, no. He loves me. And, maybe he, has a little temper or, has some things he has to work through from his past, but no, it can't be abuse. But I remember one night we had this explosive argument and I realized this was more. This was more than what I thought. And I called my mentor in tears at that point, and she also realized something was wrong. The accusations, the gaslighting, the put downs disguised as jokes, the demeaning words. This wasn't my imagination, Déa. This wasn't me overreacting. This wasn't me being too sensitive. This was abuse. Oh my God. I'm in an abusive marriage. And I've only been married 4 months. What am I going to do? Like, I can't get divorced. I'm a reverend. I mean, people are going to judge me. How do I fix this? Maybe I can pray harder, maybe counseling. Okay. But it didn't get any better. And there was one night where we got into this big argument. And it was as if I was out of body at that point, Déa. And I just remember looking at myself and hearing that voice again saying, you don't deserve this. This is not me. And at that point, that's when I walked away from my marriage. And I found myself in that hotel room alone, trying to figure out the next steps of my healing journey. And it's been a long road since then of tears, of fighting for my freedom and hope. But I haven't looked back, Déa. That's my story.
Thank you for sharing that. I definitely, even as a marriage and family and divorce coach, I can see the elements in the trajectory of discovery of what was actually taking place. And I applaud you for, even though when you say 4 months in, that there was at least a chance to do some sort of recovery, rescue and recovery within a timeline that was adequate. Because, as you know, many people may face this situation you're in and stay years in a relationship, sometimes 20, 30, and some to the point that they're not able to get out of it because they're so deep into it.
Right.
So in some way, that a blessing, but difficult, right? Just because it was something that actually worked in your favor doesn't mean it wasn't hard. And oftentimes, even as a coach, I can see that even if a person know that they have to leave, it's too difficult. So I can see where you were divided, right? In one hand, you want it to work. On the other hand, you're saying, am I making a mistake? There are all these questions. So I definitely can see the depth of this process of where you had to make a decision. So looking back, and I'm talking about not at the moment when you were in the hotel room thinking, how did I do this? But prior to understanding that what was actually going on was some level of abuse, which you weren't specific yet about earlier on. Did you see the red flags or the signs? Did you either ignore it or overlooked it?
That's a great question, Coach Déa. So in short, yes, but let me talk about this first. One thing that I've learned, Coach Déa, is that domestic violence doesn't always look like you might think it looks in terms of the person who is abusing someone and the person who's being abused. So someone who is abusive, they might be very charismatic and kind and in leadership in their community. And one might not ever think that behind closed doors, they're acting a certain way to their significant other. Same thing for someone who's being abused, they might be in leadership, they might be famous, they might be someone who is smiling all the time at church, hiding behind closed doors their pain. With that said, for me, it was very difficult for me to recognize the signs at first because honestly, I think I didn't really want to recognize the signs because for me, I so desired to be loved. I so desired to be married. I was 37 years old around that age when I met my ex-husband. And at that time, I fantasized about being married, and this man came in and swept me off my feet, and I fell head over heels. So by the time those signs started showing themselves to me, it was one of those things where I was saying, well, no one's perfect. And maybe this is trauma from his past. We all got drama, right? And so that could have been something. So those excuses were taking place. Plus, I'd never been in a relationship like that before to be able to identify when I was being controlled. I just thought that maybe he was really opinionated or stubborn about certain things or protective of me, wanting to always know where I was at, or be in my space, or not having me do certain things. It was for my good, right? Thinking good intentions because I didn't know. But here's the thing about abuse. It starts off, this example, this metaphor we often use in this space, like a frog being boiled. If you put a frog in water at room temperature at first, they don't know that they're in harm's way. But if you slowly start turning up the water, eventually that frog is being boiled and they didn't even know, and it's too late to jump out. And that's the same thing when it comes to someone who's being abused. It starts off small. It starts off, that's weird. Maybe a bad day. And your mind is still trying to process what's going on because you're holding back to the person that you first fell in love with.
Right.
And before you know it, you can find yourself in this abusive relationship. And I also want to say this, Coach Déa. I think sometimes people confuse how abuse can look. Because if someone physically hurts you, you know.
Right.
You know that's abuse. But there's different types of abuse. There is emotional abuse, there's financial abuse, there's sexual abuse, there's legal abuse. There's different forms of abuse that you can find yourself in. And because nowadays there's more awareness around physical abuse, someone who is controlling could shy away from that and say, "Oh, I'm not abusive." But in reality, emotional abuse can be more harmful. Women say that consistently who I've worked with. Sometimes I wish they would just hit me because at least I would know that was wrong. But the emotional abuse is confusing because it involves manipulation.
Right.
It involves power and control.
Right.
So when those dynamics take place and you're being manipulated and brainwashed and the gaslighting, you find yourself being confused and not really knowing what it is until it almost seems like it's too late.
I really like what you said because even as a coach, I can appreciate the fact that, first of all, every relationship is different, right? So what it looks, we know the word abuse and know what it means, but for each relationship, that can look different for everyone. And the fact that it's not the obvious, it's the subtle, right? It's the subtle that confuses. And honestly, who wants to be abused? So it's not like we have the tools. When you start a relationship with someone, there is the stage of getting to know each other. And for those of you who are listening, it's not uncommon that people would lose sight of what is actually going on because they themselves are in the mood of, we're building. This is a new beginning. So when the subtle abuse starts to happen, it is confusing. No one really, we don't have the tools. No one has the tools to say, okay, how do we even embrace a red flag when we're all in our feels, feeling happy, something just new began, right? So, and this is what is so heartbreaking about, when you do have the realization that while you were happy, it's not that you were consciously overlooking or even in denial, it's because you are in the state of hope. And many people fall into this category, and I agree with you 100%. When it's not that it's one is better than the other, but when it's obvious, you can at least grasp it, to a certain extent, you can recognize it. But when it's subtle, it's almost like it takes you into your own head. Am I crazy? Am I seeing correctly? And then the feelings of shame and fear to even go to someone. That's why I applaud you for your courage to share the journey of recognizing and reaching out to others. that was, I think, a part of, where you start to find the support to even start to even begin to say it even to yourself out loud, right? So I really appreciate that. I think it's something that everyone can benefit from, knowing that, the most important thing is clarity.
The revelation, which I got from you. I remember us talking before, and you said, Jocelyn, don't just focus so much on the disappointment, focus on the revelation.
Absolutely.
And that was really difficult for me because the revelation of taking in the painful truth and accepting that this dream that I once had of having this happily ever after marriage, it was a grief that was very difficult for me, Coach Déa, because it was a complicated grief. It was a shattering of that dream. Plus, I did love him, so we had that factor. Then emotionally, one of the other struggles that I had was it was secondary losses along the way, because I did not only walk away from him in this marriage, his family, his family I adored. They were wonderful to me. And so losing that family, then also my church home, a church that I was a part of for 16 years, who I still love my pastor there and all the wonderful members. But it was a decision I had to make to walk away because I was getting emotionally activated. Some people call it triggered, going to the same church as my ex.
Right.
And the body remembers. And
Right.
so I'm having
Absolutely.
breakdowns during worship. And so making a decision to step away. And then I was displaced from my house for over a year, a place, not over a year, but it was my house of 10 years before marriage.
Okay.
Right. And so stepping away from my house, it felt like I was just losing everything. And the world was falling apart. And so this grief that I was feeling, and then the shame. Coach Déa, the shame. Because I realized that for people who did not know what was going on, the fact that I was filing for a divorce 4 months after I got married, it was like, what? Like, how do I even explain this? And then again, my position, Reverend Jocelyn, she can't keep it together with like all these thoughts were just really difficult for me. And so with that, the process of going through that pain and those emotions was quite a journey.
Jocelyn, one of the things that I love that you reminded me, right? It's something that I had said, we discussed about the relationship between disappointment and revelation. And let me clarify that for those of you who are listening. I think in life, it's so common that when we go through hard times, hardships, life events that are either tragic or traumatic in some way, and we experience grief, loss, the narrative about that is focused on the negative, right? And even if you can, I think we're all going to feel bad when something traumatic happens, right? Any of these life events can really shake us to the core. However, instead of the narrative of the loss, if the perspective was, you have to be able to see that in spite of the pain, you're being freed from something or you're being redirected, right? They say sometimes you hear a lot of that, right? That the disappointment is just a way that God is redirecting your steps. And also not losing mind that these are the places in which we're learning. We're learning more about ourselves. We're learning about the people in our lives. We're learning how to respond and even learn how, if somebody down the road in the future was to share that story with us, that we then would be in the place to support and give that lending hand. So I love what you said, and I know that, in this process, the decision making of getting a divorce caused, it's like you opened up this Pandora's box, and now there are all these feelings, all these things that you're experiencing, and you've mentioned some of them in the question and the answer before. Tell me a little bit more about that. I know you mentioned the shame and the timeline, right? Because the timeline of 4 months in, oh my gosh, now everybody, she just got married, and all the voices that come, what are you telling yourself?
Oh, Coach Jay, it was crazy, right? Because I'm in this hotel room, right? And mind you, I was still building my ministry at the time. I had trainings in 6 weeks in a row. I had speaking engagements lined up on trauma. And so I'm going to these engagements. I felt like staying in bed all day, but I'm like, okay, gotta show up, gotta, perform. And so I go to these speaking engagements and people are still congratulating me on just getting
wow.
married and calling me in that silly voice, people do, oh, with your new married name. And I'm sitting here like, oh my God, can I just hike under a rock right now? And so I would just pretend, I would just say, thank you, and try to keep moving because I didn't want to break down in front of people talking about healing from trauma. And so this dynamic of feeling like I had to pretend because I wasn't ready yet, and having the conversations with people and telling friends about it and reliving it, and every time I spoke about it I would just break down and cry. I was so fragile. And so it was this pressure to still keep going and functioning because my work, my ministry, I wanted to show up for people. But this was a time where I needed to also be on the other side of receiving care. But it was very difficult for me because of, you might call it pride or shame, for me to say, I need help right now and I'm really hurting. And so those weeks, months following leaving my marriage was extremely difficult, and also my housing situation because I didn't leave with a plan. I bounced from hotel to Airbnbs to couch surfing. And finally, I had to say, you know what, I gotta move back in with my mama. And as a grown woman, having to move back in with the mom, it was humbling. But that's where I needed to be, Coach Déa, because it was love with my mom. And I needed to go back home to really reflect and think about what happened and what I needed to heal.
And it's interesting because, the array of emotions from grief to sorrow to shame to being displaced to being in that turmoil, right? It's like a wind whirl of all of the things. I feel like you just described all of the things, the grief, the
All the
sadness,
things.
the sorrow, the fear, the everything, right? The shame and the embarrassment, and then being displaced, having to go back to living with your mom, which is a wonderful thing to have the support, but it's the meaning of it at that stage of your life where you are actually helping people heal, the contrast, the dissonance between I am talking about something about helping people and I can't help myself. I'm trying to figure things out. Very, very interesting dynamics and not uncommon. You see, because I think that that's what abuse does. Abuse has a tendency to cause dissonance, right? It's where is it this or that? And in the end, honestly, it's not this or that, it's always all of it. And it's really hard to grasp so many things while something so, impactful is going on personally. I think that in any life-changing events, right, there is always different phases, right? There's always different phases, and I would say the first part is you try to rescue, right? The rescue is the phase where you are actually trying to pretend it's not happening. You're like, is this really happening? Is this just me? Maybe we can work it out. Maybe together, well, the church, the counselor said, you love each other, you could do this. So that's your rescue phase. Then let's say now you've gotten to the point where you've accepted that it broke. In the hotel room, when you finally realize it, right, that it was over, you are going to start your phase of adaptation. Adaptation is everything that you didn't do before that you have to do differently. And then you go into transition. Transitioning is executing the understanding that now you are in a new phase. It's a new walk, a new life. Maybe you're still staying at your mom's, but you have your schedule.
Yes.
You don't depend on, whether it was making coffee for your husband. Nobody's there. It's just you, and you have to grasp that walk and master it, right? But then you have the healing, recovery, and rebuilding phase.
Yes.
Okay? And what I need you to tell me is, what was helpful to you in that healing, rebuilding, recovery phase? What were some of the things that helped you?
It's interesting because I almost feel like some of that healing and recovery and strength was happening even before I left. And it just continued. Let me explain. So one of the things that really helped me to see things early was I was in counseling. I can't express how important that is because someone who is objective, who's trained to be able to see certain things, was able to identify certain nuances and habits and give language to what I was experiencing. So when I was making that transition to leave, and then afterwards I stayed in counseling and working through these raw, unprocessed emotions and having a space to do the ugly cry, to let out these emotions, to realize that, hey, this doesn't have to define you, right? And so counseling was huge in terms of my healing journey. Next, while I was recovering, I was also journaling. Once again, I was journaling while I was married, and that's what helped me to see certain habits and cycles and identify certain things that was happening. So journaling during, and then after I left, I started to get these, again, emotions out, because sometimes you circle in your head, but when you're able to write it out and lament and cry out to God, that's something that was really helpful for me as I was beginning to heal. I also joined support groups. I went to a domestic violence agency, and I remember the first time I sat with the intake specialist, and she read me my rights as a client, that I have a right to make decisions and to say no, and essentially I have agency to do what's best for me. And when she was saying that, I just started crying, because it was reminding me that I do have choice, I do have power. And so sitting with the intake specialist and going to support group meetings, and eventually talking to friends and family who believed me, who were supportive of me, who didn't say, girl, well, I saw them signs, like that I thought they was gonna say. You know how folks could be sometimes, right? And so I was able to talk openly to friends and cry with them, and they show up for me and just get me out of the house, because sometimes I forgot to shower, brush my teeth, all stuff. I was just jacked up. But they didn't judge me, right? And so having the friends, having the community around me to process what was going on. But then lastly, Déa, one thing that was really helpful for me was educating myself. I started reading every book I could get my hands on around domestic violence, and not just books about what is domestic violence, but also contrasting faith in my beliefs, because I was really struggling with wanting to honor God and not walk away from my marriage, but this was wrong. So how do I make sense of this? And how did I let myself get into this situation to begin with? I had questions I needed to process. So education really helped me to put pieces together. It was an important part of my healing process.
So what I hear is the power of, and this is something that I want everybody to grasp, because you said a couple of things that were very, very valuable here. The first thing was looking for someone who was equipped to help. It's something that I urge everyone. It's amazing to have the support of friends and family, but sometimes what happens is we're like toxic venting. Yeah, we're just ruminating. Yeah. We're talking, and I really think this is important to share, because people are they have intentions for us. They love us. They want to help us, but at the end of the day, we get to that point where we're just repeating. Toxic venting is the term. Toxic venting. And finding someone who's equipped to help is powerful, because like you said, now you have the tools to make certain distinctions. And it was not only that you're being told that you were free to set the boundaries, but understanding and honoring your standards. Okay? It was about your faith. It was about your upbringing, everything that you learned, everything that you're about, the things that you're preaching to other people and teaching. It's almost like you put a veil over that. Yeah, you're still sharing it, but the two things weren't connecting. Okay, right. So connecting the dots have a lot to do with the tribe you're dealing with, right? Your support system. The education was powerful as well, because I think that when you can put a name to the face, or a face to the name, right? Now you can say, oh, that's what that was.
Right.
Oh, it is going on, so I'm not alone. I'm not crazy.
Yes.
You see, the education coupled with all those other things that you did brought a tremendous amount of validation to this new journey, the journey of rebuilding. Okay, so I really appreciate this comment. I think it's fabulous. I think people need to know this. Pay attention that in the process of rebuilding, recovery, and healing, that we need to know that there's help out there. Okay? So, and with that, we're going to take a little break. So we'll see you soon.
Pastor, ministry leader, I see you. You love your people. You've prayed with them, baptized them, buried loved ones, and walked them through countless storms. But if you're honest, there are things happening in your congregation that feel bigger than you. You know that there are people in your pews carrying deep wounds from trauma and grief, abuse, violence, anxiety, and depression. And while your heart wants to help them, the truth is you don't have the training, the time, or the tools to carry it all. But here's the thing, that's not a failure, it's reality. And that's exactly why I created this resource for you. Hi, I'm Rev Jocelyn from Faith on the Journey, a leading provider of Christian trauma-informed care and grief support. Over the past 7 years, we've served thousands of people across the country through our training, retreats, and Christian counseling. And now, I want to offer the same support to you. It's called the Trauma Healing Church Guide, and I'm giving it to you for free. Inside, you'll find a step-by-step roadmap to help your church become a trauma healing community. Guidance on training lay leaders, even those without formal counseling experience, is included in this guide. You'll learn how to educate your congregation about trauma in a biblically sound way and learn practical strategies for creating a safe, healing environment rooted in faith. Even if you only implement one of these recommendations in this guide, it can create a lasting shift in your ministry. So, if you're ready to reach those silently suffering in your congregation with biblical tools, practical support, and a path to healing, visit traumahealingchurch.com today to download your free guide. Your church can be a place where healing begins and hope is restored. Let's take this first step together today. Trauma healing!
The most valuable lessons will always come from the hard places, the most difficult situations in life, the hardest life events, the ones that leave you almost breathless. I believe that the harder the fall, the higher we rise to. So, can you share some of those hard lessons? I'm sure that many were, though difficult to deal with. These are things that you will always carry with you, and it will open your eyes for newer experiences in the future. Can you tell us some of the lessons you learned?
Yeah, so one of the lessons that I learned from this Coach Déa is that there's a difference between a relationship being hard and harmful. And I think that when I was going through the challenges, I just thought yeah, relationships are hard. Marriage is hard. But when a marriage becomes harmful or toxic or destructive, there's a big difference. But sometimes it's very difficult to identify the difference between the two. But I think for me, there were certain things that were happening internally with my body that was telling me, no, this is different than hard, because I'm starting to feel like I'm losing myself. The things that I enjoyed doing, the smile, the joy that people might know for me to have, that girl, that woman is starting to fade. Mm-hmm. And I'm constantly walking around anxious and on eggshells, and yes, people argue, and that could be healthy in a marriage, but this seems like I'm feeling torn down and not feeling open to share. What is this? No, this was toxic. And understanding the difference between hard and harmful, I think, is one of the first lessons that I learned. Secondly, and this is something I learned from you, Coach Déa, that it's important to come to understand the role that we have in our pain. You taught me that is one of those things where when we find ourselves in a situation like this, no, I don't blame myself for being abused, but there was a role that I played in getting married and being in this situation. For me, one of our dear sisters, Michelle McKinney Hammond, talks about how I remixed it and say, being desperate hijacks discernment, right? That's my version of what she says, right? And how, for me, I was desperate to
Actually,
be.
the line, it's
What is the line? Let's quote her right.
Let's look right there. Desperation hinders discernment.
Yes.
And that is by our mentor, Dr. Michelle
McKinney.
McKinney.
Yes, yes. Shout out, Michelle. And so with that, I didn't discern. I wanted it so bad I almost idolized being married. And so that was a role that I played in my pain. I also realized that I did not understand the importance of boundaries. Even when you quote unquote become one, it doesn't mean that you lose yourself as an individual. And it doesn't mean that when you set boundaries, you're being mean or something's wrong. No, boundaries keeps a relationship healthy. And I continuously allowed certain boundaries to be broken without consequence. And it continued to get worse as a result of that. And then the last lesson that I learned from this, and this was a part of my role in my pain, is I didn't listen to the voice that mattered. Let me say this to you, Déa. God speaks to us. And when I was going through this situation, God started off saying as a whisper, something is wrong. And then that whisper became a shout. I'll never forget. I was in my storage room cleaning out some things, making room for him to move in. It was 2 weeks out before our wedding day. And as I was purging certain things, I went into this bin and I found this old VHS tape. And the letters on the tape said, "I can't marry you." And I looked at the tape and I was like, where did this come from? I ain't seen this tape before. And I started Googling. I couldn't find anything about the tape. And then finally, I was like, this sounds like a sign from God that I shouldn't get married. But again, we were 2 weeks out. And, when I started bringing things to him like that, I was concerned. He was like, oh, you don't love me? You're going to do this 2 weeks before the wedding? And so I just didn't have the courage to call it off. But that was God trying to say, you didn't listen to the whisper. You didn't listen to the shout. So I'm going to show you a sign. And your girl still didn't listen. And so here's what I learned, that sometimes God speaks to us and we have to drown out the outside noises around us and listen to the one voice that matters. And moving forward, I'm committed to listening to that voice within because God speaks to me.
Very good point. And, back to this very important notion of what is your role in your pain, so that we clarify here. A lot of times, the role in your pain has nothing to do with blame.
Right.
It is simply how you choose to take part in a life event, whether it's from a subconscious place or a conscious place, right? And eventually, that is also people who overlook the role in their pain. By that time that we figure out we overlook the role in our pain, it's very possible that we also overlooked our standards. Because, see, the boundaries we can adjust, the standards is the constant. Remember, our own mentor, Dr. Michelle McKinney, when I have to give her credit again, she says, keep your standards high, lower your expectations of others, but give yourself permission to maintain. In other words, that of can't be broken. Your deal breakers, we cannot let the deal breakers get tampered with, right? So the role in your pain, again, so many people don't understand that. That maybe in even as a divorce coach or a marriage coach, I see that it's like, what was the role in your pain? What do you mean? I didn't do anything. No, hold on a second. You might have not done anything. That is a role in your pain. Sometimes it can be passive, right? It can be passive. It can be something that you did or didn't do. But I do have to say this, and I say this also for you, because in these moments, when we figure out what that is, the beauty of it is that God gives us such mercy, and you have to give yourself grace and not blame yourself and not feel like, oh, I didn't listen, I should have listened. We don't have the tools sometimes, and this is why it's so important to find, I love what you said, someone that is equipped. Keyword, equipped.
Right.
Okay? I love the support. I love the family, friends, but it's getting educated. Get educated about what happened. Find out what happened. And this is why. Because otherwise, you may spend the rest of your life saying, that happened to me. He did that to me. She did that to me. You will look at what happened to you, but not at what's happening in you. And we need to honor that, you see, because when we honor what's happening in here, most of the time there would be that download. We're honoring ourselves. We're listening for this first time. We're paying attention. And we're going to hear his voice. We're going to hear God's voice. And so call it that maybe this experience also allows you to be prepared for the next thing. The lessons, the greatest lessons, will always come from the hard places. And it is that we're being positioned in some way for greatness, for better, for what's meant for us. You know, the journey isn't that trajectory of finding the one for us or being in a place where the relationship, yes, there are issues. There was always going to be some sort of, you have to resolve conflict. It's never perfect, but relationships are hard, but they're not wars.
That's right.
And if you are in the type of war that you're in, the internal war, the one that actually looks like you have a brown paper bag over your head with the eyes, and you're just walking around, losing yourself in someone else's
that's chaos.
demeanor, being controlled by someone else's decision, then you really need to pay attention. And that's when we center ourselves and ground ourselves. We're able to listen to his voice more when we honor our standards. You are very involved with the church, right? In the area of, teaching and sharing about trauma and healing. What would be one thing that you wish the church understood better in the areas of when people are dealing with abuse, divorce, and in supporting survivors?
That's such a great question, Coach Déa. Well, first, I want people to understand that there's a big difference between biblical submission and control. And sometimes someone can use the Bible to manipulate someone to have power and control over them. And that's really spiritual abuse. So we want to be careful there when it comes to that, because here's the thing about our God. God is all powerful, and he still gave us choice. He still gave us free will. So for a human to try to control us, that is something that we want to make sure that we understand that that's not God, right? So biblical submission and control are two different things. I also want the church to understand that domestic violence can happen to anybody. It can happen to women and men, children, members of the LGBTQ community. It does not matter. Again, as I said earlier, it doesn't have just a certain face. It doesn't look just a certain way. I also think that it's important for the church to understand this misnomer around Malachi 2:16. When it comes to this idea of God hates divorce, right? We heard this scripture referenced 1,000 times over, but what it's really talking about is how way back in the day in biblical context, men would divorce their wives for things like burning the chicken, right? Burning the chicken, aging, what else? They would just divorce them. And women didn't have rights to file for divorce. And once they were divorced, they were left destitute. They couldn't even fend for themselves. And so when we think about how that was in times, that was really kind of a form of emotional abuse happening then. And so what God was really speaking against was the cruelty that led to the breaking of the marriage covenant. Because when we think about the marriage covenant, let's talk about that. 1 Corinthians 13:4-7 talks about love being patient, love being kind. Love is not quick to anger. It keeps no records of wrong. That's what love, biblical love, looks like. But when we have fear and trauma and harm taking place in the marriage, that is breaking the biblical covenant, right? Instead, when we see people feeling like they're no longer safe, when they feel like they're not cared for, when they feel like they're like at a place of loss and confusion, that's not God. That is bondage. And so with that, this is one thing that I want people to understand, and particularly in the church, that we can't lose sight of the fact that we have a God of mercy, and Jesus always chose mercy over legalism. And sometimes we can get so caught up in this is right, this is wrong, that we forget the person who's in the marriage. And we start focusing so much on the law that we forget about the well-being of that person because we're valuing rituals over relationship. And I have a problem with that. And this is my challenge for the church to say, look at the human being inside of this. What is the best thing for them? And if they're in a toxic marriage, if they're not safe, value them over the rituals and religion. And the last thing I want to say is that God is on the side of the oppressed. God always fights for justice, and God hates abuse. He speaks against that. And so we should hate abuse. We should take a stand for abuse, and we should be cognizant that there are members in our pews every week showing up for service who are experiencing this, who are affected by this. And so if we understand that the church's role is to be a spiritual hospital, to be a place of healing, then we too must take a stand against domestic violence.
Very good point, very poignant. I love what you said about, that when we hear the expression God hates divorce, it's almost like, did we forget that God hates abuse, God hates injustice, God hates all kinds of things that are, that are not conducive to a healthy relationship. I think that God loves, right? Love is. So it's that relationship of God with us, the love story he has with us. Would he allow us to live a life that is less than, a love that at least is healthy? It doesn't mean perfect, right? But it means healthy. Healthy is two maybe imperfect people trying to work it out. And when you have issues, me even as a coach, I'll say, it isn't perfect. Marriage is hard. Marriage is work. And I always say, for those who think, oh, it shouldn't be so hard, that's a scam. Come on. Marriage is
Right.
hard, but it doesn't have to be a war. Conflict
Yes.
resolution is possible. We can hold space with emotional humility and emotional availability, listening to understand, not to judge. The Bible even says, don't judge, right? We're not to judge. So I think that all of those concepts, and I mean, I had to laugh about the one about people getting divorced over burning the chicken. I had to chuckle as that one took us out of the seriousness. But I mean, honestly, it is true. There is that we have to really be conscious of how the person in it. It is
Right.
not just about the rules and regulations and what this is said, the book says, but what
Right.
about the person? Again, it is that of what's happening, but what is happening here with that person, right? A level of caring that is way deeper than what's said, because we're, at the end of the day, we're people, we're God's children, and that love story he has with us would not allow us to suffer. I mean, if you had a puppy or a child, would you like your child or your puppy to suffer? No. We feel the pain. God feels our pain. And with that, I think I agree with you. The church has a responsibility to honor that, right? And the last thing that you said that I think is and something that you and I have talked about when it comes to mercy, because I think that sometimes people in situations where there is a legality to it, say a marriage, right? And then that mercy sometimes is used as an excuse. And you and I
Right.
have discussed the mercy is transformative. It's something that should take us from that to repentance, a 180-degree turn, that there is an understanding and a willingness that even if there is an issue where abuse could be a mental disorder or some type of something, that people have to get help. We
Right.
have to heal. We have to be responsible and be accountable for how we're impacting the relationship. And that it really is something that should be taught. We can't hide behind the mercy.
That's
Mercy is
right.
transformative, which requires action, a different way of walking, a change in the behavior, a new language, like you said, learning to speak and say different things. Because what you want to teach is people how to take care of themselves too. Two people show up for the exchange. They both take care of themselves. They both are resourced. They both are centered in their faith. Now you can show up and be there for each other, right? I really love what you said. I'm just like, the whole thing is true. My brain is just going and going. Amazing. So you are in a painful and confusing relationship. If you're listening and you are resonating with this story, let's say it's you, you're suffering, what would you tell them?
I first start off by saying that you're not alone. And we can sometimes find ourselves in a situation like this and we feel stupid. They're like, how did this happen to me? How did I not see the signs? And I want you, if that's you, not to beat yourself up. As you can see, I'm a reverend. I teach trauma healing class. I took domestic violence courses. It still happened to me. And I know it's a lot to take in. But the thing is, you don't have to do anything right now. You don't have to make any rash decisions. What I'm encouraging you to do is to reach out for help. Your journey starts, a journey of healing that is, starts in community. So maybe discreetly reach out to the domestic violence hotline to learn more. Maybe talk to a counselor to really assess, is this just hard or is this harmful? What is really going on here? Learn more information. And if you're at a place where you feel like this is not God's best for me, then I want you to find that power that's within you because it's there. It might have been kicked down and lost. You feel like from all the abuse that you've gone through, but it's still there. And I want you to find it. And I want you to fight for your freedom because you don't always have to be sad. You don't always have to live like this where you feel oppressed. There's hope. And God is with you and God's going to bring you through it. But it starts with you taking the first step and reaching out for help. That's what I would tell them.
Excellent advice.
Thank you.
Beautiful, really. So, one thing that's been on my mind throughout this whole very powerful testimony that you're sharing here today, and in my thoughts, I'm curious, why now? Why sharing this story now? What made you decide to share your story here?
Well, part of me honestly didn't want to. like, but I realized that there's so many other, particularly sisters who I work with in ministry who are going through the exact same thing. And I felt like my story could really make a difference in their lives. They can see, oh, she went through it, then okay, she made it. Maybe there's hope. And I remember talking to a gentleman in my mastermind community. Shout out to Joe Rivera, if he's watching right now. And he heard my story and I shared it with him on my show. And I was nervous about it. I didn't even expect to share anything about it. But he was like, your story is powerful. And I hope you don't keep it to yourself because it really can help somebody. And so for me, that's the only reason. What I shared with you was a very painful, vulnerable part of my journey. And so it would have been much easier for me to just be like, well, it's behind me. Let me keep moving. But sometimes God brings us through certain things so that you can be a testimony for others to let them know what's possible. And of course, that was a hard patch in my life, but I'm not going to have it wasted. And so turning my pain into purpose is really what this interview is about today, Déa.
I always say, pain into purpose, into power, so that you can experience the freedom, right? That freedom that love simply is. And love isn't just a romantic love, a relationship. It's that relationship that God has with us. It's the love that we have in community, the answers that we find in other people's pain. You hold the key to so many people's prison door today. I feel like so proud of you for the courage because, some things are so hard to share, but I see that within that you found the sense of responsibility. That emotional availability that you display so beautifully is about, being available to share, even if it's painful or vulnerable, imperfect, messy. Don't they say that there is message in a mess? Isn't that how God is so perfect?
Yeah.
The test that you went through, now a testimony, right? And
Right.
these aren't my words. I just want to clarify. Just using it because I think it does convey this. I'm so proud of you. Are there any last words that you wanted to share? What are some of some final thoughts?
Well, I just want to take a moment to thank you for listening to my story today. My faith was and still is an anchor in my healing. Even when others questioned or misunderstood my decision to leave, I knew God was with me. And I've come to understand this clearly. God does not call us to stay in situations that destroy us. Abuse breaks covenant. God is not glorified by our silent suffering. He is a defender of the oppressed and draws near to the brokenhearted. And if you're listening right now and you're confused and hurting or trying to make sense of your own relationship, I want you to hear me. You're not crazy. You're not weak, and you're not alone. Abuse thrives in silence, but healing begins when we speak the truth. And if you know someone walking a similar path, please share this episode with them so that they know that they're not alone either. I also want to say this gently, but firmly. Leaving an abusive relationship can be one of the most dangerous times of your life. So please don't do it alone. If you're looking for a Christian counselor to help you discern your next steps, I encourage you to reach out to a member of our team at faithonthejourney.org. There is always hope. God is with you. So go in peace and keep your faith on the journey. Be sure to subscribe and feel free to share how this testimony impacted you in the comments below. I'll see you next week, family.